This next recording is for the section of the workshop UKNIAF Work to Date, and this is reviewing the work that we have done in asset management on UKNIAF since the inception of the project. Last year in 2020, around March time, the COVID-19 pandemic hit worldwide, and at that point we were just beginning to start our wider asset management work on UKNIAF. However, inevitably, the pandemic meant that the focus had to change in the short term, both due to resources and due to changing priorities. Therefore, there was a project looking at the response to the COVID-19 work, and this aimed to identify some key routes on the Federal Road network where it was important to understand if the flow of traffic was able to move freely without impediment, both for reasons such as food security, medical reasons, and for any other urgent transport needs. So we looked at identifying key routes with the information provided by both the Federal Ministry of Works and Housing and FIRMA. And once we had identified which were the more important routes to go and visit due to limited time and resources, a team of engineers carried out rapid-driven surveys of those key routes, which meant that we could take the data coming from those surveys to identify potential problem areas. So in terms of identifying key routes for those surveys, we asked, as I said, the Ministry and FIRMA to identify key agricultural or economic routes, and that led to 14,500 kilometres of routes being given to us. When we had the locations of those routes, we also went and asked FIRMA if they had any visual condition data that related to those same routes, either the ones identified by themselves or from the ministry. And you can see the map on the right there shows all of the key routes with visual condition data overlaid. There are a few black lines on that route, on that map, and that's where there was no visual condition data available. But it shows that, we had visual condition data for a significant proportion of the identified routes. As well as looking at just the condition data, we wanted to add in additional data sources that would also be relevant to this prioritisation of routes. So that was looking at, for example, agricultural information. So we looked at agricultural zones and facilities, with this information being provided by the Ministry of Agriculture and other funded projects such as RAMP, LINKS and PropCom. And the type of data that we got back from that was locations of special crop processing zones, locations of active silo complexes, agricultural logistics hubs and warehouses, everything that was important for the movement of food and where you could focus in on particular parts of the network which were potentially more key in terms of having more food transport over them. We put all of that data onto a map, which you can see on that image on the screen now. And on top of the route and visual data and the agricultural data, we also looked at adding on traffic count data that was collected under the previous NIAF project. All of this data then meant that we could prioritise every section on the existing base map that was generated, that was already in existence for the Federal Road network, meaning that each section of the base map could be scored based on its importance of the route. Was it identified as a key route? How close was it to each of these agricultural locations? What was the condition of the road on that section? And what was its traffic level to perhaps the nearest traffic station? So a section could score in all these different categories. And what we could do, we then were able to weight these different categories to investigate how that changed the importance of the routes. And that allowed us to score the routes based on using all these different data sets and a prioritization weighting. And we could then identify the highest scoring routes, not necessarily the worst condition, because there could be some fair or good condition, but maybe they were very close to lots of agricultural facilities. But using all of those data sets, we could weight all of the sections and identify the key routes, which led to 40 highest priority survey routes being picked for surveys, 10 each in the northwest, northeast, southwest and southeast of the network. So for those 40 identified routes, the engineers, combination of UKNIAF and firma engineers, carried out rapid driven surveys of those routes, which lasted about 2 to 3 weeks. One of the data sets they looked at was doing an up-to-date visual inspection for all of their for every 5 kilometre length of the network, so aligning with the process of the existing firma visual surveys. They also focused on identifying potential problem areas. And these are what we classed as points of interest or bottlenecks, things that could be problematic to the traffic movement. At those locations, they looked at taking relevant measurements, recording images, and any other relevant notes that they would record in the field. You can see some of the bottlenecks on those pictures towards the bottom right. As well as identifying the problems, whilst they were out doing the survey, they also looked to identify what remedial actions would be needed, and when they were back at post-survey, they could analyse all of those to determine the costs along the routes that would be needed to bring the route back up to a certain standard. We got a lot of information back. It was a great survey, more information than we were expecting. And we put all of that information back into a data viewer reporting tool, which would mean that the data was all available in one location for everybody to view, or indeed whoever wanted access to it. That data was over 6,000 kilometres of routes, as well as over 1,000 individual points of interest or bottlenecks, which were accompanied by over 3,000 images. There was supplementary information also added into the data viewer, which consisted of field notes and measurements. Following on from these surveys, the ministry saw the data viewer and liked the survey technique, and they also requested surveys on their Highway Development and Management Initiative routes, their HDMI surveys. These were sections of the network that had been identified for potential concessioning, and so what the ministry were looking to do was to find up-to-date information on those routes, so that would help in the process of establishing them as concessions. So the ministry provided the locations of these routes, and again, we carried out rapid-driven surveys of those key routes, doing a visual survey and identifying potential problem areas. So the HDMI surveys did a condition survey, which was very similar to the COVID-19 surveys. There was also a few supplementary data collections gone into these surveys, which was location of junctions, interchanges, bridges, and areas of encroachment onto the carriageway, for example. And the result was that the ministry identified 12 routes that they wanted mapping, and 3 survey teams completed those surveys in December 2020, which was a combination, again, of UKNIAF staff and other federal controller of works. That led to approximately 2,000 route kilometres being surveyed. Now, most of these routes were dual carriageways, and we surveyed both sides of the carriageway, which meant there was approximately 4,000 carriageway kilometres surveyed. So again, what came back from this was a very large data package. There are over 2,500 points of interest or potential bottlenecks, as well as over 2,500 supporting images. And again, the aim was to put this data into the data viewer, so that again, it could be available for people post-survey, but also importantly, people that weren't necessarily out on the survey. It could be shared between different engineering teams, different decision makers, if required. So both those sets of survey data, the COVID-19 and the HDMI survey data, went into the data viewer. This is an example of a screenshot of the data viewer. You can see there's visual condition data on it. There's information on individual defects that are collected, as well as the ability to scan through all of the images. There is a separate video on the data viewer, just a short sort of like 8-minute introduction that talks about the data viewer, which I will make available separately for those who would like to have a bit more information on the data viewer. So just looking back at the data that was collected, I think one of the success points of these surveys was that the visual condition surveys aligned with the current FIRMA methodology. There was nothing new for people to learn here. FIRMA already looked to collect their visual condition data in 5-kilometre chunks. It works for them, and so we replicated that and aligned with them. And that's why we have these 5-kilometre blocks in the data viewer. We collected information on individual defects, landmarks, points of interest. So that could be potholing, shoulder failure, or in terms of landmarks, information such as toll gates or bridges for points of interest. All of that information was collected along the route and can be analysed, separately using the data viewer. This data and the data viewer and the survey technique has been well received. I think, looking back to some of the earlier asset management slides we had in the presentation, it's a simple asset management approach to start with, but it is asset management. It's using data to make decisions. And therefore, because we have this data and everybody is looking at the same data, the decisions should be robust and they should be repeatable. It's using evidence to come at the answer for those decisions. And therefore, that adds more justification to suggested works or maintenance. And again, going back to some of these earlier slides we've looked at in this workshop, this simple approach can be built on. So whilst this is all working, in the future there may be more data that wants to be collected or data collected slightly differently. The data collection technique can be enhanced, therefore, and be adapted. And therefore that will mean that the decision making can change. But, what we're doing is we're taking these steps. We're starting with a fairly simple approach, aligning with what's currently there, and then it can be built on both as capabilities and resources and data, ideas develop. Just pointing out a couple of other bits of work that UKNIAF have done in asset management. We've also submitted some reports on the immediate, longer term asset management requirements. So there's 2 reports there, as well as also talking about some of the high level asset management principles. Those sort of documents span a lot of what you've been presented about in some of the earlier sessions and what we're going to talk about towards the end as well. But they are there for yourselves to look at. They've been produced by UKNIAF. They will act as some guidance. And they present some of the best practice ideas that we've already been talking about and the type of things that, an organisation can, work towards in terms of enhancing their asset management activities. Lastly, we've also been working at the moment in asset management on enhancing the base map. So the base map for the Federal Road Network was created initially under UKNIAF 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. This has been used, to date by FIRMA and other organisations. It continues to be probably one of the better representations of the Federal Road Network in Nigeria, but we are aware that it wasn't complete when it was completed before, partly due to the fact that we couldn't get data for certain areas, but also because, over a period of 3, 4, 5 years, roads change, dual carriageways get added in, roundabouts get built, and so we also need to come back and update the map for key areas as well and look to add in any changes. So at the moment we're working with FIRMA to increase the coverage of the mapping and to incorporate any changes since that initial base map was created. We've currently got a good process that we work with the federal engineers to go through that when looking at people who have local route knowledge, and we will continue that process until we complete that base map. That will also form the fundamental backbone of sort of locating where future surveys may need to happen. This base map is key to linking the data back to the network. Thank you for your time listening to those slides on UKNIAF. This is the end of the narration for the UKNIAF Work to Date section.